Hey, hello, hello, hello. Hello, 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 hello. Today is, um, today is, Stalker and this, Dugin and Mearsheimer debate. It's a 3 hour long conversation. I'm only gonna do two. Maybe I can do 2.5. I am not looking forward to. It's gonna be painful the whole time. I don't even know if it's worth listening to because it's just gonna be Kremlin talking points the entire time. But it's good to inoculate and see if anything's new. Any new talking points we have to address. So here we go. Nothing new here. So
Affecting Ukraine right now.
Yeah, I'll say a few words and then turn it over to Professor Dugin. There's no question that President Trump has said that the one issue area in the world, which is Ukraine, that he's going to really fundamentally alter American foreign policy is in that conflict. And as you said, he says he's going to shut it down very quickly. I do not believe he's going to shut it down very quickly. I believe he may have good intentions, but it's not going to happen. And the reason is that he would have to accept terms that Putin has laid down to settle this one that I believe no American president would ever accept. And specifically, Putin has said before he will even negotiate, this is to begin negotiations to come up with a peace settlement, the West, and here we're talking mainly about the United States and Ukraine have to accept two conditions. One, that Ukraine will never be in NATO, either de jure or de facto, that Ukraine will be a neutral state, a
why would it
genuinely
matter
neutral
unless
state.
Russia has ambitions
And furthermore,
to take it?
That the West and Ukraine have to accept the fact that Crimea and the 4 oblasts that the Russians have now annexed are permanently lost. They're permanently part of Russia. And again, Putin is saying, before I even begin negotiations to settle this, to come up with a peace agreement, you have to accept those two conditions. I find it hard to imagine the United States, even President Trump, accepting those two conditions. I find it hard to imagine the Ukrainians accepting those two conditions. Now, one could argue that President Trump is a very special person, and he has views that are outside the mainstream. And he is, after all, the president of the United States. But the problem is that he is surrounded by people who have Russophobia in the extreme and have been super hawkish on Ukraine for years. It's not like Trump is bringing into office with him a good number of people who share his views about shutting down the Ukraine war. He's bringing into power, as is very clear, a bunch of hawks.
Look at this guy smiling.
Therefore, Trump is going to be surrounded by people who are not going to want to accept the conditions that Putin has laid out. So my view as to what's going to happen here is that this is going to be settled on the battlefield, and I believe the Russians are going to win an ugly victory. They're in the process of doing it. And at some point, you're going to get a frozen conflict or you're going to get an armistice. And the end result is you're going to have bad relations between Russia on one side and the West and Ukraine on the other side for as far as the eye can see. I think this is a terrible situation, but I don't think that Trump is going to change things in any meaningful way and be able to come up with a meaningful peace agreement.
On my side, I can only agree totally with what Mr. Mearsheimer has said.
Let's put on the guilt trip with your daughter.
The
Or maybe
situation
she's
is
doing it in
more
her honor.
radical that you have described, because the conditions put forward by Mr. Putin officially don't correspond to the real intentions of Russian Federation. So that was a kind of minimal conditions that were put in the front precisely because nobody could accept them on the West. So in the reality, the situation with Ukraine is much more existential and important for Russia. We could not tolerate any kind of Ukraine hostile to Russia, any versions in any borders, inside of any borders. The point of agreement, consensus inside of Russia
stiff.
that the war will lead with the West in the Ukraine should end with our victory and nothing less. That is not just the vision of Mr. Putin. That is the condition of Putin to stay in power and to save our political regime. So that is much
But
more
we don't care about
than
that.
just hawkish or imperialist reactions or desires or dreams or something like that of emerging once again independent power in the Eurasia. It is much more than that. So, and I think nobody in the West understands that correctly, because for us to be or not to be as Russia, as Russian Federation, means to win or to lose the war in Ukraine. That's much more than the conditions that Putin had put forward. And Mr. Mearsheimer has very correctly explained, and I agree totally with this opinion, that these minimal and unsupportable and unacceptable conditions that Putin has put forward, they have no chance to be accepted by the future administration of Mr. Trump. With his agreement or against his will, I think there is the kind of geopolitical or realist, if you want, logic that the West and United States could never, I would say, never accept not only expressed and explicit claims of Russia,
How do I make it not
but
automatic?
much less implicit claims of Russia that they go much more further than just keep in our possession the territories we have won or neutral status of Ukraine. So Mr. Mearsheimer has explained very well the realist balance of power in this situation. And I think as well that we need to separate in Russian understanding of Trump's administration and Trump's factor two things.
Okay, so
First of all, Russia is in agreement. Russia supports eagerly the orientation of Mr. Trump against globalism, globalists, against cancel culture, and his fight for restoration of traditional values. All that is very well accepted in Russia. But I think in the terms of the realist geopolitics, there are so huge contradictions that I would say they stop precisely in the moment when these possible, virtual, probable negotiations start. In that moment, there will be the huge amount of misunderstanding on the deep level of the mutual understanding of the nature of the conflict in Ukraine that will prevent any possible solutions. So I agree once more with Mr. Mearsheimer that the result or the end of this bloody conflict will be decided on the battlefield. So that will be no armistice, no truce, no peace talks, but rather the weapon that will decide the fate, the destiny of this geopolitical conflicts. And that's beside, or I would say, beyond a Russian great impression of Trump, because Trump is, in our eyes, he is defender of the traditional values, and we applaud that. We totally agree with that. As Elon Musk recently has said, cancel culture should be cancelled. So we should stop with this left liberal agenda on the global level. In that sense, Russia will support absolutely that. But on the term or in the realm of the realist geopolitics, I think the contradictions will not disappear, or maybe will aggravate more.
If I can just pick up on what Professor Dugin was saying and make two additional points. He used the word existential threat. And I have long argued that it is imperative from a Western perspective to understand that putting Ukraine in NATO is an existential threat from Russia's perspective.
Then why?
Once you accept the fact that Russia views Ukraine in NATO as an existential threat, you realize just how dangerous the situation is, and you realize that the Russians will fight to the death to prevent Ukraine from being in NATO.
Why?
Because it is an existential threat. It threatens their survival.
Why?
The problem that you face in the West is that hardly anybody accepts that argument. And they will say that NATO
go on
expansion
with your
is
argument.
not
You're just
an
saying,
existential
you're making the
threat to
proclamation without any.
Russia. And they believe that what's going on here is that Putin is just an imperialist. He's an old-fashioned aggressor. He wants to create a greater Russia by incorporating Ukraine into
Mearsheimer
it.
didn't
And this
read
has nothing
Putin's
to do
Nova
with an
Rossiya.
existential threat. My argument is, you may not think, you in the West may not think it's an existential threat, but what you in the West think is irrelevant. What matters is what the Russians think, and in particular, what Putin thinks.
Why?
And the Russians have made it perfectly clear, in my opinion, from the very beginning, that Ukraine inside of NATO was unacceptable. It is an existential threat. Nevertheless, we continue to talk about
it's a defensive
bringing
alliance.
Ukraine into NATO, number one. And number two, if we don't talk about bringing Ukraine formally into NATO, we talk about creating a situation where Ukraine is a de facto member of NATO, where there's a strong security relationship between the West, especially the United States, and Ukraine.
Why not?
This drives the Russians crazy. They view this as an existential threat.
Why?
But we refuse to accept that. And if we refuse to accept
why is it an
that,
existential threat, John Mearsheimer?
Ukraine in NATO off the table, you're never going to get an agreement. And that's a point I think that Professor Dugin and I agree on. The second point I would make is that the more we push to maintain a tight security relationship between the West and Ukraine, this is the de facto NATO argument, and the more we talk about a de jure relationship where Ukraine is actually brought into NATO, the more we incentivize the Russians to capture additional territory in Ukraine and to destroy Ukraine. It's completely counterproductive from Ukraine's point of view. It would be
no,
in
it's
the
not.
West's interest and in
Because either way, they're
Ukraine's
gonna
interest
lose.
to accept the fact that Ukraine cannot become a member of NATO and go to great lengths to come up with a genuine peace agreement. But because we in the West refuse to accept the argument that the Russians make that Ukraine and NATO is an existential threat, we continue to wave this threat in the face of the Russians. And the end result is the conflict will go on, and in the end, Ukraine will be destroyed. It will end up as a dysfunctional rump state.
It's going to be
And it
destroyed
will
because
lose
why?
its territory to
Because
Russia.
why?
And furthermore, this will be a humiliating defeat, not just
There
for
you are.
NATO,
There you are.
but the West itself. So what I'm saying here is that by refusing to accept the fact that the Russians view NATO expansion into Ukraine as an existential threat, the West has basically shot itself in the foot and destroyed Ukraine in the process.
So I totally agree with that. So that is, I have remarked
been
some years ago that the West has finished to think in the realist terms. So what is realism in the theory or practice? So you can imagine not only your position in the balance of power and
what is realism?
international relations, but as well you take in consideration the position of the other. So you can think
guys suck.
this way, but the other thinks differently. As realist, you put on the balance both positions and you try to come to some rational solution. That is maybe cynical, maybe outside of moral, but realism in the international relations precisely that. So you evaluate the real capacity, the real possibility of the other than you, and you take that in consideration in calculation of your national interests. So that was starting from Morgenthau and Carr in the international relations. That is uninterrupted line of realist thinking. And I think that Mr. Mearsheimer has explained it excellently. Everything is completely clear. If you consider Russia as an object in international relations, you could say we need to punish it, we need to put it in the border, we need to overthrow Putin and so
yeah,
on.
conditions.
But if you accept that that is not just
Sanctions.
object, but subject, so you start to consider, to explore, to study its subject perspective. And in this subjective perspective appears precisely what Mr. Mearsheimer absolutely clearly defined as existential threat. And that is so. So for us, you can blame us, you can call us aggressors, imperialists, and so on, but for us, Ukraine in NATO means existential threat. And Mr. Mearsheimer,
They're not debating. They're just talking, apparently.
said one very important thing about the fight to the death. And if the existential threat is perceived as such in the eyes by the subject of the nuclear power as Russia, the death
Does Mearsheimer just kind of
means
look like a
not
pussy? I
only
mean, is that
the death for Russia or for Ukraine.
9 millimeters?
The death in the case of nuclear power involved, means as well the possible death of the Western
can go
Europe
down and
or United
collect.
States. The death means the death for everybody. So, and that is precisely what Mr. Putin wanted to emphasize some years ago when he has affirmed clearly that the world without Russia could not be tolerated
This is second language. It's okay.
by Russia. That is the nature and a deep dimension of an existential threat. If something threatens you existentially, you could prefer to destroy everything, universe, life on the earth, humanity, everybody. But you should save yourself. So the price is in the case of nuclear power with nuclear weapon capable to destroy humanity is very high. So it is maybe
yeah?
you could say
Why is it high?
Say, so
Why
that
is it
is
high, Dugin?
crazy. That is anti-humanist or something like that. Maybe, but that is moral evaluation of what is going on. But on the level of the mutual realist understanding on what we think to be existential threat. So that we need to take that in consideration.
Yeah,
For example,
any
if
competition,
Russia
any
would,
conflict is a
invite Mexico
threat,
in
and you
the
guys are just narcissists.
military alliance with Russia and Mexico, and at the same time claims to restore the Texas and other ancient Spanish territories inside of United States now. So you can imagine what existential threat is it for us. I am not speaking, as Mr. Mearsheimer here, we are not speaking about moral, about liberalism, about values. We are speaking about interests. I appreciate very much, I have studied ideas of Mr. Mearsheimer about offensive realism. I completely agree with this line of thought. You could criticize that, you could accept that, but that is absolutely brilliant exposition of what is going on in the reality. And maybe I think the lack of realism will play very bad job with Trump's new administration. The realism could solve this conflict. Realist approach. When we involve the moral, liberal ideals, democratic values, and so on, we are losing the reality of the seriousness of the situation. And I think that Mr. Mearsheimer has shown brilliantly what is on the stake.
There are actually many layers of questions that I have from the conversation just now. Is that we are in agreement here. Everything is well said and heard. But how many people do you think, I suppose I would direct a question to Professor Mearsheimer first, is that how many people do you think in the United States actually understand what we are discussing here? Because it is about a world of perspectives.
What are you
right?
trying to say?
You can argue that, hey, we are benign hegemon, there's nothing to worry about. Well, it's not about what you think, it's about what Mr. Putin, what the Russian people think. So playing between a conflict, between a war of perspectives, and potentially with nuclear weapons at stake, how many people side with you? How many people understand your perspective in America? And also to follow up on that is that, why the recent provocation, why the recent escalation? Calling on lowering military aid in Ukraine and allowing Ukraine to use American-made long-range missile by the Biden administration right before he's about to leave the office. Why?
I think
Guy
it's
came
fair
out of
to
nowhere.
say that hardly any Americans accept my views on the Ukraine conflict.
Because you're just selling out Ukraine.
What really is happening here is, to use the rhetoric that Professor Dugin was using, it's almost impossible for most Americans to put themselves in the shoes of the other. In other words, American policymakers,
There's
American
a
foreign
mission
policy elites are not good at thinking about how the Russians might view Ukraine in NATO. They have their own views, which
Bro.
they think are the dominant views. This
How
is
about the
captured in a
Ukrainian
very
views?
famous
What is-
comment
what does Ukraine
by
want, dude?
Madeleine Albright in the late 1990s. She said, "We are the indispensable nation. We stand taller and we see further." Just think about those comments. We, the United
think they're
States,
shooting each other.
we're special. We're exceptional. We stand tall.
Yeah.
We see
Dude.
further. This is all a way of saying we know what is best for everybody else. We have the approved solution. And what's really happening
Oh, this
here
guy's
is
such a
that
sellout,
when the
dude.
Cold War ended and the United States had won this tremendous victory
World
and
War II?
ended up as the unipole, the most powerful state in the system, with this liberal ideology, we thought that we could spread liberalism
Democracy?
all over the world.
And
Which is a
capitalism?
way of saying we thought we had won, not just geopolitically, but we had won ideologically, and we were in a position where we could cause every other state in the system to become a liberal democracy like the
If they
United
want.
States. And we were so full of confidence that we could shape the world in our image that we fell into a situation where we found it impossible
Dude,
to pay
it's called
serious
reinforcing
attention to what
democratic
other
principles
states said.
of
And by
countries
the way,
that wanna
this is
be
not just
democratic.
Russia, it's China as well. The United States thought it knew what was best for China. This is what the engagement policy towards China was all about. It was to make China look like the United States. And of course, the United States wanted to make Russia look like the United States. So you had this situation,
This guy's
which was
retarded.
always present in the United States. It was always there that we had some difficulty putting ourselves in the shoes of the other side, for sure. But after 1989, and certainly after the Soviet Union collapsed in December 1991, we fell into a pattern where it became almost impossible for us to strategize. Strategy is all about thinking about what the other side is thinking and what the other side will do in response to what you do. That's what strategy is all about. This is why realism is inextricably bound up with strategy. But we really, in a fundamental way, lost that ability. And therefore, when the Russians said, this is an existential threat, and they said it over and over and over, it's not like you could look at one speech where Putin said
You know
it's
what's an existential threat?
to bring Ukraine
Going to war
NATO.
with,
Putin said it millions of times. It's crazy.
Man,
All the Russian
trying to hit
elites said
reload.
the same thing, but we refuse to believe it. And it's because we believe, and I think this is still true, that we are the indispensable nation. We stand taller and we see further. And we know what the Russians really think or what they should think.
Dude, it's
And
called
what they think and say
KGB,
they think
FSB.
just doesn't matter that much.
Retard.
And when you're operating on those kinds of lines of thought, you're going to get yourself into a lot of trouble. And that's why we're in a lot of trouble, not just in Ukraine, but in the Middle East as well.
That were the great words of the
Who's in
wise,
trouble
really
in
wise
Ukraine? Who's in
men,
who's in
and
trouble
I would
in the
say
Middle
that
East?
I
Is it
would
the United States?
certify that 2005 I was in Washington speaking with Mr. Brzezinski, Mr. Zbigniew Brzezinski, and there was the chessboard, the real chessboard in front of us, between us, and I have asked Mr. Brzezinski, do you think that the chess is the game for two players? He has said no. When I have called two great Eurasian chessboard, I have meant precisely the logic of the game and not the quantity of the players. So there is only one player at the chessboard. That is to see, to be tolerant, to see further. That is attitude, or that inspires the confidence that you are alone at the table of the global geopolitics. And when Putin popped up in that sense, and China popped up on the scene of this chessboard, that was in South moral
Little
attack
bandages.
against this consciousness that the chess is the game for one player. That is unipolarity, not only or on the geopolitical level, but as well as Mr. Mearsheimer has emphasized on the ideological level as well. So liberal democracy is unique, universal system of values, and the interests and values of the West are unique. So when someone appears on the other side of the chessboard, that is a scandal. We need to punish it immediately. We need to cut it. We need to destroy it. We need to bring the strategical defeat
I wonder
on
if
Russia
Mearsheimer has actually
immediately,
read any
because
Dugin.
the chessboard, the chess is the game for one. So I think that is completely irrealist attitude. So realism in international relations is based on the acceptance of the sovereignty. And if you accept...
Hold up. Let's see. Yeah, I really wonder. Let's see. There we go. Sooner or later, the endless spectacle is over. Then we will take revenge, mercilessly. This guy doesn't realize who he's talking to. Liberalism's the main evil, and communism and fascism as well. Real life matters, not this abhorrent and mean liberals. What else? There's some... You could probably just, like, go to images and see some terrible shit. I'm a real National Socialist, you better believe it. Today's Ukrainians are a race of degenerates that crawled up from the sewage. Genocide is in order. For the first time in history, Russia is fighting an absolute war. All previous wars were relative and prototypes, prefigurations of this one, which is the main one. Only this war is the final one, the last and irreversible significant. This guy is fucking... I don't want to say evil. The American Empire should be destroyed. Mm-hmm. And this book is insane. And there's I think there's worse ones, but I haven't read them. Let's go to his ex. He's really mad at Turkey right now. come on. I thought, where is he at? I know I followed the dude. Yeah, what the hell? There are so many ties between Russia and Turkey. Its behavior is clearly in favor of Israel and globalists. Now, it is sad. Russia is not so weak as the West wants to present it. I believe that the miscalculation on the side of Erdogan, we supported Erdogan until now. Without Russians in Syria, Erdogan loses very important ally and friend. He shot down your planes. He's the only European country that has the balls enough to shoot down your planes. By the way. So I guess Turkey is going into Syria and kicking out Russia. Russia's pretty mad about it. Dude, Alex Jones looks crazy now. The end times. War transcends the nations and religions, peoples and states. It is vertical and accomplished final division. I better take care of these guys.
The sovereignty. You accept the possibility, at least theoretically, to behave as you wish, because there is no other instance that could say oblige you to behave in this way or another way. That is the nature of sovereignty. If you accept sovereignty, you accept the existence of other player, Chinese, Russian, maybe Muslim as well, as in the case of the Middle East, or India, maybe, or Africa, Latin America. So we are dealing with the other subjects that are other than ourselves. That is very tragic, I think, that United States of America and the collective West in general lacks today this strategical approach. With existence or presence of this strategical approach, we could imagine much more easy solutions for some crises in the world that seem to be irresolvable, accepting multiplicity or diversity of the players and civilizations.
What is the political ideology of Dugin? He leaves it up in the air, by the way. Fourth political theory.
So we are discussing in a framework that we are living under the dictatorship of American-led liberal democracy, and they're so full of themselves that they don't see how people from other parts of the world, leaders from other sovereign nations, may have a brain of their own. But is
then
there
do
also
what
a possibility?
do your own
this
thing.
is a question who
Nobody's
a friend
stopping
of
you.
mine gave me before the conversation started, and he's a proponent for liberal democracy.
It wasn't.
His question is that are we sort of giving the United States too much credit that it is the master, the puppet master orchestrating behind it all? Is it also possible that the conflict in Ukraine is a result of the long history between Ukraine and Russia, between people living in the eastern part of Ukraine and the western part of Ukraine? Is it possible that it is a very local issue?
I will let Professor Dugin go first this time, since I've gone first in answering all the previous questions. I think it's only just that he have a chance to go first,
So,
and then I can respond.
So, in my opinion, we could not reduce the importance of the Russian-Ukraine conflicts to regional scale. So that is geopolitical issue of a larger scale because in the reality, the identity of Ukraine nation is very recent. It is artificial and recent because Ukraine never existed in history,
Here it comes.
and that was just the part disputed between Russian Empire and Poland and Austria and the West in general. So that was the frontier between two civilizations. Politically, Ukraine was liberated first of all from Turks, and that was not Russia or Eastern Ukraine. That was the territory that belonged to the Turks, to the Ottoman, and not to some imagined Ukrainian state. There was nothing of sort in history. So that was the fight between two empires, Russian Empire and Ottoman Empire, for some frontier, for some border zones, and Russia has won the control over what we are calling now Novorossiya, from Kharkov, that was the part of the other ancient region, to Odessa. That was the part of newly acquired.
Yeah, and the empire fell because it sucked.
Russian
That's
Empire from
you gotta let
Turks.
things die, my dude.
No Ukrainians were involved because they
Just like this
didn't
guy.
exist in that situation. The western part of Ukraine was the same people, the same culture, the same religion, Orthodox, but the western part was, after the Mongols invasion, under influence of Lithuania and Poland, and partly later of Austria, and having the same, exactly the same identity, roots identity as ourselves, as Russian from Muscovite Russian, the Eastern Russian, they were under control of the Polish Catholic and Austrian as well Catholic. But they fought, Ukrainians fought for their Orthodox identity under the rule of the Catholic Poland and Austria. So we could not regard them as the part of the Western Europe as well. Western Ukrainians belong to the same root, to the same tree of our historical identity that fought against the Polish and against Western Europe. The experience to live some centuries under control of Catholic European nation that has made the impact, the influence over their identity. And in Lvov, Lemberg, in the most western city of the Western Ukraine, that is regarded, is considered as a capital of all the Western anti-Russian ideology.
Don't say anti-Russian. It's anti-imperialism.
Two parties.
It's
pro-Moscovite and and Russophobic parties coexisted. There is the complex history of identities inside of Ukraine, and the unique way to save the newly established national state of Ukraine was to take in consideration both identities, pro-Russian Eastern identity and more or less not so radically anti-Russian identity of the Western Ukraine, to make a balance, to create a state as Belgium, for example, with Wallons and the Flemish people balancing each other with different linguistic identities, historical experience, and so on. So that was the chance, and they have lost.
13,000.
The Kiev regime has lost this chance, choosing only one identity, Western Ukraine artificially created. Western Ukraine identity cleansed from pro-Moscovite Orthodox elements, to liberated from this part of the deep Ukrainian identity, and creating artificial pro-Western, European Union, LGBT plus, globalist
Oh,
liberal
he doesn't like
identity,
gays.
artificial, in order to fight against Eastern Ukraine and Russia. So, in that
Yeah,
sense,
let's check out his
regional dimension of Ukrainian conflict, we could not discard. We could not.
Let's check out what is Dugin's Dugin, fucking Yahoo. Dugin, LGBT foundations of geopolitics. Let's go for LGBT. There's another guy down there. It's cool that we can just like. Oh shit. Okay. Sorry. You got it. Why you gotta mess with me, dude? Okay. Here, we'll just go to watch this real quick.
Alexander Dugin is a 62-year-old.
Revolt against a national state as collective identity in favor of.
Well, here's what he says about. Okay. In his 20-minute conversation with Carlson, who is known for spreading far-right conspiracy theories, Dugin argued that liberalism frees people from any kind of collective identity that has led to transgender people, to LGBT, and new forms of sexual individualism, so sex is something optional. Calling LGBTQ lifestyles not a deviation but a necessary element of implementation and the victory of this liberal ideology. So apparently, he believes that collectivism prevents gayness because everybody has to follow some sort of rigid cultural norms. I think most people would prefer not to. I know he's got a. Let's do the image search again. Examining how movements in Europe and elsewhere oppose same-sex marriage, sex education, and other phenomena they perceive as expressions of a harmful gender ideology. Anti-gender. You know, he's like, he claims to be a philosopher. He's just kind of a sick dude.
Forget it exists, and it existed historically because that was the history of the fight between the Great Russia, Moscow,
Man, I don't wanna kill a bunch
against
of
the
dudes.
West,
Oh,
the
this is
Western
so
Europe,
annoying.
and the Ukraine was the frontier,
Maybe go
the
take
battlefield in the time of
this
Peter
loot back
the
and
Great,
sell it
before
so I
in
can
the
walk
time
around
of
freely.
Alexis Romanov. That was the battlefield until the Stalin's time, when the Western Ukraine was annexed to the Soviet Union. So that was the eternal battlefield of Russia to expand our border to the west or to diminish our influence in that orientations. That regional dimension really exists, but it doesn't explain everything, because when we consider the place of the Ukrainian conflict on the geopolitical scale, on the global scale of the confrontation between unipolarity defended by globalists, not realists, in USA, and emerging multipolar world order where Russia pretends to be sovereign pole as well as China and other poles. So that, I think, regional aspect is the secondary comparing with these global geopolitical level.
Two quick points. One, Zhao Li, you pointed out that the United States is this awesomely powerful country, which I think is true. But it's very important to understand that we no longer live in a unipolar world, that we do live in a multipolar world. There are three great powers in the system, and although the United States is the most powerful state among those three great powers, I think the United States is the most powerful, China's the second most powerful, and Russia's the third most powerful. The fact is, the world today is fundamentally different than it was, say, in the 1990s when we were in unipolarity. And I think the Americans have had a very difficult time coming to grips with the fact
with
that
other
we're
countries
no longer
existing
in unipolarity. A lot of American leaders want to act as if it's still a unipolar world, and it's not. And the United States has to be much more careful.
If we pulled our Navy
because it's
out,
dealing with two other great powers,
hello
both Russia
viewer,
and China.
how you doing?
Second point I would make has to do with Ukraine. I think, as Professor Dugin said, there are all these sort of heterogeneous forces at play inside Ukraine that were there independent of NATO expansion or Western policy.
I'm over
I've
encumbered,
always
which is
thought,
why I'm
since
walking
the
so
Soviet
slow.
Union
Going
broke
back to the
apart
base.
and Ukraine was created, that there was the potential for civil war. I'm not saying it was going to happen, period. But in the early 1990s, I thought there was a serious chance that what happened in the Balkans might happen inside
they had
of
their
Ukraine.
Maidan Revolution. That was
But the
their
key point here is that
quote-unquote
NATO expansion,
civil war.
EU expansion, and the color revolutions, those three policies.
See, this guy
in
says color
tandem
revolutions. So he believes the CIA is going in.
Exacerbate and make worse all of those tensions inside of Ukraine. And that's why the situation blew up in 2014.
I just hate the fact that it looks like
you
a
want to
grandfather.
remember, there was no serious trouble. There was no fighting inside of Ukraine until 2014. And what happened in 2014 was in good part consequence of Western
Yanukovych.
policy. There was a coup inside of Ukraine that the United States played a key role in making
That's what you
happen.
believe.
We were interested in doing social engineering inside of Ukraine. This is what the Orange
Supporting
Revolution was all about.
democracy,
We
yeah.
wanted to bring Ukraine not only into NATO, we wanted to bring it into the EU.
No,
And
they wanted
what
to
this
join the
did
EU.
was it took all those
They didn't want to join
heterogeneous
the- they
forces
didn't want to join
that
NATO
were
until
at play
after they were
already
invaded.
inside
By the way.
of Ukraine. It exacerbated them, and the situation blew up, number one, inside Ukraine, and number two, between Russia and Ukraine, and between Russia and the West. And here we are today.
I'm going to switch gear a little bit to bring China into the fold, since the both of
I
you
would love to
mentioned it
see
also
some evidence.
Since Trump's re-election,
Some
there's
actual
been quite
evidence
a bit of speculation
CIA
about how
color
the
revolutions.
U.S. is now going to realign its foreign policy, and then is about to drive a wedge between the emergent alliance between Russia and China. How likely, question to both of you, how likely do you see that happening?
I'll answer that very quickly. I think it's clearly in America's interest, speaking as a strategist, for the United States to be allied with Russia. And that way, the United States can concentrate on containing China. And as you know, I've long argued that the United States should try to prevent China from
I
dominating
hope I don't
Asia,
get.
from becoming a regional hegemon. And I think it
Yeah,
makes
good guy or
no
bad guy?
strategic
Good guy or
sense
bad guy?
for the United States to
Good guy.
drive the Russians into the arms of the Chinese, which of course we have done with our foolish policies.
Okay.
So your question is it likely that we will
Lo
change
siento,
our
amigo.
policy and that we will end up having good relations with Russia and, in a sense, separating the Russians from the Chinese? I think there is hardly any chance that that's going to happen, because I think, as we were discussing before, there's hardly any chance that relations between the United States and Russia are going to change anytime soon. And in fact, I believe, sadly, that the United States and Russia are going to be bitter enemies for the foreseeable future. And the end result of that is the United States is going to continue to try to damage Russia, to hurt Russia. And as a consequence of that, the Russians will have very close relations with the Chinese, because the Americans have their gun sights on China as well. You have this situation where the United States has it.
It was I don't think Putin ever said this publicly, but the idea that Russia's friends with China, dude, they're gonna, if they don't win, they're trying to fight this so that they don't lose to China, because things. Yeah, no, it's a bad argument, but
gun sights on both Russia and China. And unsurprisingly, Russia and China have become, I think it's fair to say, close allies. Maybe not formal allies, but close allies, as they should be. And it doesn't
right,
make
Dugin?
strategic sense for the United States.
Does the Orthodox
for
and the Communist
but doing things that make strategic sense is not something
does
that
Orthodox
the United States pays
Russia and
much
Communist China
attention to
jive well together?
these days.
Does that
So
fit into your
that's the sad
multipolar
state of
polarity?
affairs here in America.
So that is a very correct explanation and description,
Is it?
As long as I understand. I would say that I am a little more optimistic about strategical sense in Trump's future administration. I observe some trends inside of appointments and some people that I have contact with from newly established American Trump's administration that are the signs that maybe, I hope, there will be more strategical dimension in the future American policy, international relations. Relying on these sources or these presumptions, I would say, I could say that Trump will try to rebalance a little bit relations with Russia and China in favor of Russia and against China. That is not only his subjective, individual understanding, but that is the logic, as Mr. Mearsheimer has said, the logic of strategical attitude. And I think that at some point, the new administration of Trump will try to make not peace, but just to calm down relations with Russia and to try to, I would say, to sabotage these strategical alliance, growing alliance between Russia and China. At least he would try. I think he will try to do that. But at the same time, that is an important thing, that this strategical alliance between Russia and China, if we accept and if we agree, and I personally totally agree with Mr. Mearsheimer about the conditions of multipolarity already here, not just in the future, not as desire or plan or expectation, but the correct description of the reality, there are at least three complete and established poles: United States, obviously, the West, collective West, Russia and China, or China second and Russia. I agree with this consequence, but we should not forget India, Akhand Bharat, Greater India, emerging as well as independent player, not on the side of China, not on the side of United States, not on the side of the Russia, but as something independent. And the Islamic world now very, very weak. I agree, but Islamic world, Africa, Latin America, new emerging poles, maybe would-be poles, the future poles of multipolarity. They are already here. They are already in BRICS. So they are operating on the second level, establishing more and more and more elements of this multipolar world system. And in that sense, I think that is not about three-polar vision. So, for example, to tear Russia from China and to get it closer to the United States is hardly imaginable, I think. But at the same time, I think that United States, Washington, will try to do that. They will try this strategical approach, and they will fail because it is old-fashioned way of understanding strategy. The strategy of the multipolarity is something totally else. Trump would try to do precisely that, to shift the attention from Russia to China. Hostile attention, not positive attention. But I think that multipolarity is much deeper than it looks like now. So the relations between Russia and China are not about just situational alliance against the pressure of the collective West or United States. Is something deeper. And as long as I could judge, Mr. Putin and Mr. Xi Jinping, they understand the strategical depth of the Russian-Chinese alliance, Greater Eurasian Alliance, not just as situational response to the challenge of the mutual situation to be under some attack from the West. It's something further. So maybe we could finally doubt that the West is taller and further. Maybe it is smaller and sees closer to its own misconceptions of the reality. Reality of multipolarity demands the new hates, new positions, new strategical dimension. It is not only just let us keep Russia a bit closer and China a bit further from us. So we need to reconsider the relation on the other terms, and that is a challenge, I think, to the intellectuals of new wave, because the intellectuals of the old wave, they have lost everything. So their understanding of reality has totally failed. Absolutely. So we need some new way of multipolar vision of the world, including American interests, including Western interests in values inside, not excluding. So we need to understand and accept the existence of some other, and maybe other, who is hostile to us, but we need to get inside of its brain and to think with him accordingly, not just project our wishful thinking or self-fulfilled prophecy on other. That is my point.
A lot of what's been discussed just now, and on many other occasions that the two of you have been quite outspoken about analysis of the current world affairs. It's essentially a guess game on the intention. So if I can direct this next question to Professor Dugin, is that I mean we've had quite a few occasions over the past year to see each other in person, but I've never actually had the opportunity to ask you this. And so let's put it in the background of also the current Ukraine conflict. Is that tell us about the intention of Mr. Putin, really, because I've heard this from some friends living in Western Europe also, is that their fear is that should Russia's aggression towards Ukraine go any further, it's not going to stop there. Mr. Putin's ambition is to go even further west. So first fold
Yeah,
of the
according
question
to
is
the
that
documents that
to what extent is
he's
that true?
published on
What is
the
Mr.
Kremlin
Putin's
website.
true ambition? And the second question is quite specific about China, really. You are a controversial figure in China, not just because your current reported influence in the Russian administration, but more for what you said quite a few years ago, almost like 20, 30 years ago, that in your book you said, I may be paraphrasing here because of the translation, so correct me if I'm wrong, but you said, from what you see, China is Russia's most dangerous neighbor to the south, and it must be in Russia's interest to the maximum possibility be dismantled, China as a great power.
Nice. She called it
From
out.
that to what you've been talking about multipolarity, what explains your apparent shift?
Yeah, isn't that so strange that that contradicts what they were saying earlier about China?
Quite a few years, but that was more than 30 years ago that I proposed my geopolitical understanding of the role of China in front of Russia, and that was beginning of the 90s. So it is not quite few years ago. Beginning of the 90s, that was totally different situation. Russia crashed. Russia totally submitted to the Western.
Sounds like the weaker you are, the more hostile you are.
And China, in our eyes, was the kind of complice, the power that has betrayed Eastern identity and joined globalization process in order to be the part of the global pro-Western system. That looked like that. Maybe I was wrong already in that way. I could not.
It's
I
cute
could
that
not
he's
judge
willing
that,
to
but
concede that.
That was the idea of how to consider China being the part of the West, being more and more involved in the globalist economy, and in Russia present pitiful conditions under Yeltsin, and that was precisely some geopolitical vision of that. China being more and more involved in the West, more and more globalized, and Russia more and more losing its sovereignty. So that was a kind of geopolitical despair, I would say. And the thoughts like that, they belong to this epoch. When I tried to, first of all, when Putin came to power,
dude, that shit should discredit you
came
completely
power,
as a
we,
political
in my eyes, in my
operative
Russian
thinker.
patriotic eyes, the situation was very, very different. So we see Russia returning to the global politics, maybe, as Mr. Mearsheimer has said, at the third rank, far distant third pole after the United States and China. I agree.
John
I don't argue that we are number one.
He's a geopolitical
number
cuck.
three, but we are number. We are not nothing. We are number three with nuclear
can't look at this
weapon.
dude
Number three
without
is
just
something.
being
It is
disgusted.
not nothing. So, but that is not about that. And from Putin's time and from Xi Jinping time, I have, and most of all after visiting, thanks to my friends in China, visiting China, teaching in China's institute and Fudan University, and making contacts with different Chinese thinkers, I have arrived more than 20 years ago it's not few years ago. So more than 20 years ago, I have arrived at the conclusion that China represents the main strategical ally for Russia in constructing multipolar world. And from that time, that is more than 20 years, maybe more, I've started to revise my previous geopolitical attitude of this age of despair of the early 90s. So many times I have explained that, but globalists, they are playing their game. They starting to cut some expressions and terms from previous without context, previous texts, and in order to destroy our relations. So I would say maybe I am not the only one who has changed this. That is much more important than myself. So I am not the only one who has corrected the attitude to China in a much more positive way. So multipolarity is much more than our national interests, than your Chinese national interests, American or Russian. And in dealing with this strategical dimension that Mr. Mearsheimer emphasized, always emphasizes now, I think we need to teach the art to not only follow what is good and seems to be right to us in our eyes, but we need to understand others. So when I started to learn what China is, I have totally changed my opinion. So I think I have missed the point in Chinese involvement in globalization. What point I have missed? I have missed the point that China is still the great power, very national-centric society with the deep Confucianist ethics, and it could not be just socialist as in the West or capitalist. It is something Chinese. We need to understand, to get deeper and exploring the Chinese identity, to understand its behavior, its psychology, and finally I think I came to the conclusion 20 and more years ago that China is most reliable ally of creating with Russia and other poles, as well as India, not too pro-Chinese, all the multipolar system. When the chess is played,
I think it's time to get up.
At least against Brzezinski, or in the multipolar.
I'd like to get up. I would like to get up.
3, at least maybe 4 and more. So we are inside of strategical fields that we need to put Russian-Chinese relations precisely in these fields if we understand under the strategy some meaning that Mr. Mearsheimer has explained previously very well.
May
Time to go for a run.
Sorry to cut in again, but may I quickly get a comment on what, or at least in your perspective, what is the intention of President Putin? Because it is, I mean, speaking of, it's all a game of perspectives here. It is perspectives that I hear from people actually living in Western Europe that they believe containment or at least keeping Ukraine neutral is not the end game of Mr. Putin. Is there any truth to that?
Concerning Ukraine should be, in the eyes of Mr. Putin, or either neutral, totally neutral, but a friendly is neutral or ours. So that is all. So neutral we tried, we failed. So it should be ours.
Neutral or ours? Because
I would repeat the same. Either it will be neutral, or it will be ours. So that is for and people like Orban, people like Georgescu in Romania, people different other persons understand it very well. So we cannot tolerate hostile or weak and aggressive entities dangerous distance to us. So, but the threat of Ukraine is existential, and the threat of the Eastern Europe is less existential. So it is, I think, the product or the case of the bargain. So maybe a bit more hostile, or a bit more neutral, but we prefer to be neutral or friendly. Hostile Eastern Europe represents for us existential threat of the second degree, of the second degree. So Ukraine represents for us the existential threat of the first. It is deeper. That is more or less how I would consider.
If I could just make a very quick point on this latter issue of Putin's intentions. Putin has never once said that he was interested in conquering any country in Eastern Europe and making it part of a greater Russia. He just never said it. The second point I would make is the Russian military is not capable, in my opinion, of conquering all of Ukraine and then conquering countries in Eastern Europe. As everybody surely recognizes, the Russians have had a difficult time conquering the eastern one-fifth of Ukraine. The idea that this is the Wehrmacht in World War II that's poised to launch blitzkrieg into Eastern Europe and then into Western Europe is an argument that makes zero sense. It's a crazy argument. The Russian army is a quite formidable fighting force, but it does not have the capability to conquer countries in Eastern Europe. The third point I would make is the Russians occupied Eastern Europe during the Cold War. It was a nightmare. They had a big insurrection that had to be put down in Germany, East Germany, in 1953. They had to invade Hungary in 1956. They had to invade Czechoslovakia in 1968. There were 3 times they almost
They
had
should probably
to
negotiate
invade
them.
Poland to put down insurrections. They had huge problems with the Albanians and the Romanians. The idea that the Russians want to go back into Eastern Europe and try to manage the politics of those countries is a laughable argument.
So then what's the real politic question, John Mearsheimer? Everybody exerts the amount of power that they can.
And he surely understands. I believe that even occupying the western half of Ukraine would lead to unending trouble because of all those ethnic Ukrainians there that Professor Dugin was talking about before. The last thing he wants to do is start trying to conquer countries in Eastern Europe. I've been there, I've done that, and it did not work out very well.
Exactly. In that sense, I agree.
If it is okay with both of you, can we possibly move on to the topic of Middle East? And then I also hope to leave a bit of time for our friends, some of them influencers, some of them from the media, to ask a few questions because many of them are joining us from around the world, literally middle of the night for them. So on the point of the Middle East, Gaza, is there any possibility of us seeing a ceasefire or any sort of resolution in the immediate future?
I'll say very quickly, I think there is a possibility at some point that you'll get a ceasefire, but will you get a resolution of the crisis between the Palestinians and the Israeli Jews, or will you get a resolution of the war or the genocide in Gaza between the Israelis and Hamas? I think the answer is no. The Israeli goal is to defeat Hamas. I do not believe they can defeat Hamas. I think the Israelis have obviously damaged Hamas considerably, but Hamas is still a formidable fighting force, and the Israelis are in no position to decisively defeat Hamas. And the Israelis have no strategy for settling the conflict inside Greater Israel between the Palestinians, Israeli Jews. other than to ethnically cleanse them. And I do believe the Israelis have been trying to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians from Gaza and from the West Bank, but they have not succeeded. In all likelihood, they will not succeed. And the end result
guy is just
is
full
the
of brilliant
conflict
takes.
between the Palestinians and the Israelis will go on for a long, long time, long after I pass from this planet. And you also want to remember that the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians is only one of three big conflicts involving Israel at this point in time. There's also a conflict in Lebanon that involves Hezbollah on one side and Israel on the other. And even though you just got a ceasefire, the fact is the Israelis did not decisively defeat Hezbollah. They cannot decisively defeat Hezbollah. And this conflict is going to go on for as far as the eye can see. And then the third conflict, of course, is between Israel and Iran, where the United States might even be involved. The Israelis cannot defeat Iran. And this conflict shows no signs of ending. And indeed, there's a real danger that Iran will get nuclear weapons. So when you look at the Middle East, it's a bleak situation, much like Ukraine. And in my opinion, there is no hope for putting an end to all these conflicts anytime soon.
Do you think the Trump administration might even consider even the slightest possibility to get involved most directly, particularly between Israel and Iran?
No, I think that the Biden administration has demonstrated clearly that we have no interest in getting involved in a war with Iran. It's a war we could not win. And if we did get into a war with Iran, it would incentivize them to get nuclear weapons. So I don't think the Trump administration will be interested in fighting a war against Iran. By the way, what's been going on with regard to Iran and the United States is that both Iran and the United States have been trying to avoid a war between the two countries. Iran doesn't want a war with us any more than we want a war with Iran. It's the Israelis who have been trying to drag us into a war with Iran.
Oh, really?
The Israelis want the United States to attack Iran, to destroy its nuclear facilities once and for all, which is impossible to do, but they want us to try to do that. And they want us to do so much damage to Iran that we will affect regime change in Iran. And presumably we will then get a government in Iran that's favorable to the United States and to Israel. This is delusional. This is not going to happen. Most American policymakers thankfully understand that, and therefore we're trying to avoid a war with Iran. And again, Iran's trying to avoid a war with us. But it's the Israelis who are trying to drag us into a conflict. And I don't think the Israelis will
Does he just say stuff? Like, what?
With the Trump
Can you back that up with
administration,
anything?
where they failed with the Biden administration. But one never knows.
I would like to add some words. I agree, General Fisher's, with what Mr. Mearsheimer has said, because it is true. I just want to make one observation of
These guys haven't like said anything.
theoretical level. So strategy and realism
Like perspective sharing.
is limited as attitude, as a manner of analysis to some levels of the reality. And when realists, they remark something that goes beyond the strategical realist dimension, they say, oh, that is just irrational. And there is a kind of too irrational attitude, I think, in the strategy in the international relations. On one hand, liberal idealism, that is promotion of the liberal democracy against the interests of, for example, the United States.
I just don't understand why you'd be against democracy.
Globalist?
Like, you just have to be a wacky
globalism.
dude.
What is globalist attitude? To sacrifice
You know what? I don't like
American national
like having a
interests in
voice.
order to promote some agenda of LGBT individualism, posthumanism, something that sounds progressive, and in order to promote this
Just waiting for John
agenda,
Mearsheimer
the way
to
is
nod.
to get
Yes,
beyond
I also hate
American
gays.
national interests. So we are dealing here with some perverted kind of idealism. So ideals beyond the interests. So something that is liberal way. But in the case of Israel, we are dealing with the different kind of not realist attitude. It is not liberal anymore. It is the kind of eschatological agenda. So I think if we consider Israeli far right, or religious right, they consider the reality on the totally differently than ourselves. That is not strategical. That is very idealistical, but not liberal in liberal sense. They think that the time of Mashiach, in which the Jews, Israeli Jews,
Dude,
believe,
you're an
should
Orthodox
come.
Christian,
The
so
time of Moshiach, of the Messiah,
you're just as bad.
has come, and in order to accelerate his appearance, so Israel should prepare the path, and to prepare the path is to cleanse the territory of the greater Israel from any kind of shells, any kind of something that doesn't belong to the core of Israeli identity, and to blow up Mosque Al-Aqsa, and to start to build third temple. That is how Bezalel
And they should.
Smotrich or Ben-Gvir or Dov Lior or other intellectuals inside of far right of Israel, they conceive the situation. So they are beyond any strategy. So kill Palestinians, cleanse Gaza, cleanse West Bank, conquer Damascus, kill Assad, cleanse any Palestinians from the promised land. That is the way to accelerate first coming of Messiah. We could say that it's possible, we could say that it's totally irrelevant or irrealist, but it is so. If we are consequent realists, we need to understand that. And they consider United States as just their tool to win. It's not some superpower that they need follow their orders. So they totally they mock on United States. They consider this very stupid but huge power that should be used in to achieve the goal of this small, relatively small group of people, but with very fanatic ideas. That adds some eschatological element to the Middle East strategy. So we need to put on the same scale, on the same level, the realities, strategical realities, what United States wants, what Iran wants, that Syria or Hezbollah or Hamas could afford, and this eschatological level of totally irresponsible, comparing with strategical level of thinking, behavior. So, and that being not strategical, not realist in its core, in its nature, it acts on the level of the global strategy. So that is, I think, a very important element. So Mr. Mearsheimer has shown some years ago in his as well controversial texts with Walt, how small Israel is in front of global American interests, how secondary, how unimportant Israel as real political entity is comparing with the global interests of United States of America. And that is totally correct on the level of the realist strategical analysis. That is totally true. But if we take in consideration subjective reality of the Israel government, we could say they are ready to violate any kind of realism, any kind of strategical thinking in favor of their messianic ideals, and we need to deal with that. So it is quite irrational to start war between the United States and Iran, but such war could
guy.
happen.
He's like,
in spite of the contradictions to the interest, the logical, rational interests of all three countries involved. That will destroy, if we consider that in the purely material aspect, Israel. It will damage American strategy, and it will make harm to Iran. Nobody is normally interested in this, in such kind of war, except the people who think differently, and they are not just the marginals. So we should not underestimate marginals. They sometimes they are key players in, as for example, Bolshevists on others. So we need to take them as well in consideration, and that is why I think the situation in the Middle East would not be easily put to truth or peace talk or ceasefire in Gaza or elsewhere in Lebanon, precisely because of this factor. It is just a maybe minor factor in the politics, but it is very powerful in the Netanyahu's government. I wouldn't underestimate that.
I would be happy to open it up to questions if you think that's best. Professor Dugin.
Professor Dugin.
Yes, okay, great.
So Ms. Camilla is from Venezuela. She is, as with many other participants, she is a reporter, a influencer on social media, commenting very much on geopolitics and international affairs. So here you go, Ms. Camilla.
Thank you for hosting this, and thank you to the professors for responding to our questions. Just a correction, I'm not from Venezuela, but I worked for many years at S.T.A.L.K.E.R based in Caracas, Venezuela, but I am Latin American, and so I'm going to tie that into my question.
with a perfect American accent.
So the U.S. and other NATO governments have tried to rally support for their wars in Latin America and the Caribbean. They've made visits.
Which ones?
They sent the Southcom commander to hold meetings with Latin American governments to do things such as try to convince them to trade in their arms for U.S. weapons. So, they're also trying to get them involved in supporting Israel's projects of war over there in that region. In particular, perhaps you can, either or both of you, I'd love if you could comment on the role of Latin American governments in these different conflicts. In particular, perhaps comment on the role of the friends of the incoming U.S. President Donald Trump, friends like Javier Milei, the president of Argentina, Nayib Bukele, who's a very good friend of the Republicans in the U.S. And these leaders seem to be quite antagonistic towards the multipolarity project and anyone promoting multipolarity. They're quite antagonistic to Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. And so perhaps you can just touch on the role of Latin America.
I'll say a few words about it. I don't think Latin America matters that much in the Ukraine conflict or in the Middle East.
I was about to say in general.
There's no question that when you talk about world opinion, that matters. And the United States cares greatly about what world opinion says regarding Ukraine. The United States wants as many countries as possible to be pro-Ukraine, pro-Western, and anti-Russian. And in the Middle East, the United States wants all sorts of countries around the world to support Israel unconditionally, the way the United States supports Israel. So in terms of world opinion, we care about Latin America. But the fact is that the United States does not have a lot of influence in terms of how Latin American leaders and Latin American publics think about these conflicts. So we have this situation where in the West, there is support, widespread support for America's position in Ukraine and for America's position in the Middle East. But outside the West, that's not true. And when you talk about outside the West, you're talking about Latin America. You're talking about Central and South America. And the United States has not been successful in getting much support from Latin America in Ukraine or in the Middle East. So in that sense, Latin America matters, and it's been a problem of sorts for the United States. But if you look at sort of power politics, if you look at the nitty-gritty of what's going on in places like Ukraine and places like the Middle East, Latin America just does not matter very much, because Latin American countries, to be perfectly frank, don't have a lot of power to throw around on the world stage.
Oof.
And therefore, they don't matter that much in terms of the nitty-gritty of these conflicts. But they do matter in terms of public
That was the
opinion.
best
I
white
think
splaining that he could do.
On the level of the balance of power for calculation and measuring of the real potential, Mr. Mearsheimer is totally right, once more. So I don't think in the reality that Latin America matters in the Middle East or Ukrainian conflicts, but I think that Latin America matters in terms of multipolarity. And I think that there is the clear conflict between two world visions, trying to save unipolar moment, to prolong it, to keep it still alive. And that means that nothing of a sort of a pole would ever appear in Central America or South America. So that is preventive strategy. I think Milei and the other pro-US leaders, they are preventive weapon against the possibility, the virtuality of creation of something like a consensus of Latin American countries. And I think that we have two, but I would like to add that we have two versions of the possible unification of integration of Latin American countries, that is leftist, represented by Venezuela, of Chavez, by Cuba, by Nicaragua, but as well, we have the very interesting conservative version of Juan Perón, Getúlio Vargas in Brazil. So we could aspire, or we could hope that once there will be moment of Latin America becoming the independent pole. But in order to get there, you need to overcome many local contradictions of post-colonial nature. But I think that
Post-colonial nature. What are you doing?
That is almost not important.
What is
factor
Russia? But a colonial power. Come on, dude.
In the context of the power politics on the global, global scale.
Power.
And I agree that the influence of Latin America in the Middle East conflict or Ukraine is very, very small. But in the future, I think that Latin America could play very important role in creation or facilitating or helping the multipolar world system to be established or to sabotage it. So I think that Brazil is trying now to converge, to invest somehow in this multipolarity being present in BRICS, and Milei tries to sabotage this multipolarity. That is clear, but I think
Milei
that
is
is
trying
the
to?
next round of the global game of the balance between multipolarity, emerging multipolarity, and declining unipolarity. It is next round, and it is of less importance, obviously, than what is going on now in Middle East or Ukraine, and what in front of what will happen, I think, soon in the Asia, and Taiwan, with Taiwan problem in the Pacific Ocean, and Africa and Latin America will go after. You have your role to play in this multipolarity, but I don't think that today in the balance of power, Latin America really
I mean, if
matters.
Argentina
I
dollarizes,
think that
then
maybe
they
including
kinda will.
in
If they join
opinion,
NATO, then they
global
will.
opinion of Latin American population as well doesn't matter too much.
And the problem,
West, we are very, very happy and very grateful to Latin America to support our will to establish multipolar world order. In that sense, we are grateful, and for us, it matters. But in the real balance of power, I would rather agree with Mr. Mearsheimer that is secondary elements and arguments.
Thank you very much.
But I just want to cut in here because we're talking about multipolarity.
okay, before we continue on, and I don't think I will continue on. I think I'm gonna end the stream, go to sleep, so I can go to work tomorrow without being tired. And the idea of multipolarity. I've read one of his books, Dugin's books. I haven't read John Mearsheimer. I've only seen him speak. Multipolarity existed. I mean, that was the Cold War. And whether or not it's ideological models competing or material forces, it was just kind of a competition for who would kind of take the, not moral high ground, but the ideological high ground. Which system produced the better outcomes? And it's been quite obvious that it was liberalism that created the best outcomes. And so many countries across the world adopted that model with the support of the US. And this unipolar order that Dugin complains about is literally just the US dollar and the US Navy providing infrastructure for global trade. And I want to say human rights and stuff. Obviously, we're not going to invade. What was the last country that we invaded? Was Libya? Iraq before that. But all of these countries didn't respect these. They were doing the same thing that Russia's doing now. And this grasping for, or this fight that's happening. I mean, I pulled up these graphics earlier and the quotes earlier of Dugin essentially wishing genocide upon the Ukrainians, and how he was, and how that girl, the Chinese girl, called him out for, in the 90s, who said to dismantle China. Like this Russia mindset is just, it's, I don't know, man. I don't, it's not peaceful. It's very subversive. It's very like aggressive. You could say that about the U.S. or something, but I think countries fall to Chinese and Russian power, and I guess U.S. power too. I don't know. I just wanted to listen to this video and kind of get some perspective. It's 3 hours long. I can't do 3 hours. So, in other news, we're producing this track. It's just something I recorded tonight. Called it Snake Oil. Recorded it with the Moog, the Roland JX03. The drums are the Roland Integra 7. And, you know, just kind of playing with layers and things like that. I'll work on it. The guitar is kind of cheesy. I don't know about that. Little Aphex Twinny. What's that? Where's my gross beat at? Where's my gross beat? Fun times. Okay, that's the end. Have a good night. Fuck!